listening to the Astral Hour. I'm your host, Astral Meadow. Join me as we take a glimpse into the mysterious. Welcome everyone. Today I'm joined once again with my friend Braun. In our last episode, which was episode 27, we covered paganism and Norse mythology. And today we're going to explore these topics even deeper. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy and excited to be here again. It's been about a year, I believe, since I was on last.
Yeah. That episode has had so much love, and I was just really surprised at how many people reached out and were like inspired by it. And it was so cool to bring that topic forward for some people. So
that is awesome. I'm definitely excited. One of my favorite subjects to go on here.
Yes. For those who haven't listened to our last episode, could you briefly give us a little background on yourself and some of your passions?
Absolutely. So my background, I grew up in a family. I was actually a product of an unplanned pregnancy of parents ages 13 and 15, believe that or not. I know it sounds crazy, but so I grew up with my maternal side of the family, my grandparents, and I was exposed to a lot of domestic violence, some abuse in the household, a lot of neglect. Some of my youngest memories of my childhood were being left home alone at age 8 or 9, while my grandparents would go out to the bar and drink, and they would come back drunk as entirely different people. And those were some of my earliest memories as a kid. Probably not the most fond moments of childhood right there. So needless to say, that created an impact on who I became. Into my teens, I started to become depressed. I fell into a deep state of depression. I started suffering from severe anger problems. I became very unhealthy. My diet consisted of Taco Bell, McDonald's, and a case of Mountain Dew probably every 2 or 3 days. And my lifestyle consisted of playing video games from the time that I woke up to the time that I would go to bed. And that was about my life. High blood pressure, pre-diabetic, chronic depression, constant anger, and your typical life of a teenager right there, right? So I grew up, and my paternal grandfather, my dad's dad, was a Baptist minister. Now, I was not too close to really either side of my family, and I wouldn't necessarily say that I grew up in a religious environment per se, but I grew up in what you would be called like a non-religious Christian household, at least on my maternal side. My paternal side was much more involved with the church, much more affiliated with the Baptist minister, approach, and which, can you believe the irony of my dad being the typical son of a preacher, having me at the age of 15 years old? We have to laugh about that. It's an ongoing joke, but so I'm getting into this topic of religion here because this is sort of what opened up the door for my spiritual development later on in life. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to recap a couple moments when I was really young. I remember I was at my great-grandmother's apartment, and my neighbor at the time, he was an Indian man, and he was an incredibly kind man. He helped take care of my great-grandmother, and we would often go over to his apartment, and I remember on his fireplace, he had 3 statues that aligned the mantle of his fireplace. He had a statue of the Buddha and Lord Vishnu and another Vedic god that I cannot quite remember. And at the time, I had no idea what they were, but I always thought they looked really cool. As a kid, I'm like, oh, those look really cool. And I asked him, I'm like, hey, what are these statues? And he would say, oh, this is Lord Buddha. This is Lord Vishnu. And I remembered those names. And sometime later, I was in Sunday school with a distant relative who I would often go to Sunday school with to hang out with my cousins. And I remember I was in Sunday school, and they were talking about Jesus Christ being Lord. I'm like, this is interesting. You're talking about Jesus, and I've never heard any reference to the Buddha or Lord Vishnu. And I asked the Sunday school teacher, I'm like, who is Lord Vishnu? And I remember this particular moment that stood out to me. The look that I got from this Sunday school teacher had peered into my soul, almost looked like I just uttered some satanic curse. And I cannot remember verbatim of what it was said, but I remember being left with so much guilt and so much fear to the point to where I actually began fearing my neighbor. This was associated with satanic practices. And I know those words weren't necessarily used at the time, but it was heavily implied. And it struck fear into my heart to where I began fearing this neighbor, thinking that he was some, horrendous, monstrous being underneath his human flesh. And he was the kindest, sweetest man you could have ever met, who would have given the shirt off his back to anybody. And looking back in hindsight, it's very apparent as to what was going on. So that was my real first exposure to religion. And I was an inquisitive kid by nature. And I had often talked about, well, is it possible to believe in God or gods without necessarily believing the Bible? And it was always met with, well, you cannot accept an existence of God if you don't accept the Bible, because the Bible is his word. So it was a false dilemma looking back in hindsight, but in my mind, it was just black or white. You either have to accept it as it is or as it's not. So that's sort of the gist of what led me into that journey. When I was in my, I want to say early to mid 20s, I was going through a divorce. I was at an all-time low in my life, and going through a divorce, I was chronically depressed. I had thoughts of suicide, and couldn't be much lower than what that could be right there. And I'm like, wow, I'm at a point to where if I don't figure out my life, I'm either going to end up dead, or I will just be an absolute miserable shell sleeping my life away. And I honestly felt that I was a burden to the world. And from that point on, it's when I started discovering the power of hypnotherapy, hypnosis. There was a few things that led me down that venture, which allowed me to start reappraising the subconscious mind, reprogramming who I was. And then a couple years later, I was led into my spiritual journey. And from the spiritual journey, everything unfolded from that point on.
Wow, beautiful. Could you go into a little bit about what inspired the Syncretic Pagan page that you host?
Yeah, absolutely. So I created the Syncretic Pagan page. This was probably about 6 months ago, because I often share various spiritual posts on my social media platform, and they're simply reflections of my belief, of my philosophy on life. And I specifically labeled it Syncretic Pagan, because pagan is an umbrella term that's used to describe any indigenous practice pre-Abraham religion. Mm-hmm. And at the root of all of these practices, the core tenets are virtually the same. So when we think paganism, how often do we hear the terms Norse paganism, Greek paganism, Egyptian mythology, Native American spirituality, African spirituality? We hear these terms, and in our head, we tend to differentiate between them. Now, the only defining difference between these terms are the cultures that practice them. But we strip away the cultures, we strip away the names, and at the core tenets of these belief systems, we essentially had the same practice. So the Syncretic Pagan Instagram page is a page that I created to where I can create this content. I can draw these parallels between different belief systems. For example, a practicing Hindu or a Native American spiritualist, two entirely different cultures and entirely different parts of the earth. Eventually, essentially they're sharing the same belief systems. So the Syncretic Pagan is an outlet to where I can demonstrate the core tenets of these belief systems.
I love that. When you were talking about like your introduction into like some of the other deities outside of Christianity, it reminded me of how I was exposed. And I was in Sunday school, and my Sunday school teacher was taking a college class on world religions. And so she brought all her notes and decided to teach other religions in Sunday school class, but from the lens of like understanding one another.
Sure.
It's funny because this girl is still technically my friend on Facebook, but I'm like, thank you, because you're the one that like opened the door for me. But as soon as that happened, I went and bought like a book that had all of the different religions in it, and like wanted to study the mythology, and I just knew that there was some underlining interconnection between them all, and that, it's silly to like discriminate or hate one or anything like that, because I just think like at the core, if you could just align with like the virtues and the love and compassion and unity and all that, like that we would be fine. Right. And it doesn't really matter which one you go with. you know?
Absolutely. And I think in today's modern age, it's so common to associate yourself heavily with one of these labels like, oh, I'm a Norse pagan or I'm a Celtic pagan.
Right.
What does that really mean? Ultimately, what it really means at the face value of this is you simply follow those cultural practices, which is fine. Which is fine. But in terms of the belief system, they were all and are compatible with one another. There is no conflicting information that says that you cannot honor deities of other pantheons outside of your culture. In fact, it was highly common for this to happen. In fact, even when Christianity first began to spread in Scandinavia, the Norsemen actually were willing to accept Jesus Christ, not necessarily as their savior, but as another deity. Like, oh, great, another deity. He is not ours, but that's great. It's like it's akin to shopping at a specific grocery outlet that you like to shop at. Say you go to Target, but then you acknowledge the existence of other grocery stores, but you tend to be partial to the one that you patronize. And it's as simple as that. So there is really no conflicting information amongst any of these pagan practices.
Yes, I think that's one of my favorite things about paganism is the acceptance and just it's like we're totally okay with whatever anyone else wants to choose. And I just feel like that's amazing. Like at the core, like that, shouldn't we all kind of be like that? And I think that's why I'm the most comfortable with the word paganism, you know, if I have to pick one, because I feel like it allows me to kind of pick and choose what resonates with me, you know, without feeling like, okay, I have to devote everything to one deity or I have to exclude my friends now that are practicing this other thing. And so I love it for that reason.
Absolutely. And none of the practices, at least to the forefront of my knowledge, require exclusive worship or honoring to any other deities at all. That's strictly an Abrahamic concept.
Right, for sure. What sort of things do you cover on your Patreon page? The Drengr, is it?
Yeah, Drengr discipline.
Drengr
discipline. Yes, I'm glad you asked that. Drengr. So Drengr is an Old Norse word, and the original meaning of the word Drengr was a standalone rock that would stand alone in an ocean, withstanding the current of the waves. And it stood strong in its foundation, and it was immovable. It was an immovable object. And that term later on was carried into the warriors on the battlefield. The Drengr would be somebody with fierce determination, fierce courage in adversity to be able to go head on into battle, into conflict. And Drengr discipline, developing the Drengr mindset, is a brand that I established earlier in this year. And every culture has what we would consider the warrior mentality. Now, to the Norsemen, it would be the Drengr. To the Chinese, it would be the Shaolin monks. Maybe to the Japanese, it would be the samurai. You know, maybe in modern day United States, it would be the Navy SEALs. And every culture has a variation of this mindset. And what I do here is I combine mind, body, and spirit to become aligned so you can become the best version of yourself as possible. So on my Drengr Discipline Instagram, my Drengr Discipline Patreon, I offer this content for people who are willing to subscribe, where I release mindset tips of the week. I release workout tips of the week, workout tutorial videos. I release PDF files on mindset development, on spiritual development, physical training, everything in between. I offer video presentations, and all the way up to my highest end tiers, I offer one-on-one work with me directly.
Awesome. Yeah, I love following your work on social media, and I'm always just amazed at the amount of content that you are able to create. It's always great. I'm always learning something. I'll like wake up tired. I'll see one of your videos. I'm like, I guess I'm going to start lifting weights today.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. You know, it's funny because a lot of people have so many talents and creative aspects of themselves. Ever since I was a child, I've always felt that writing was one of my outlets. Writing, being able to express myself in words, was an outlet of mine. I remember writing stories when I was a kid of superheroes, probably because that's what I longed for in my life, was this heroic male figure, because I didn't really have any heroic figures in my life. So I took to writing, and now as a 36-year-old man, I can have a more effective way at conveying this out to other people. And if every now and then, if I'm scrolling or I see a post or I hear a topic, I will write notes. I'm like, this is an amazing post for a topic that I'm going to speak on or write about later. And then I save that. And then I always have my own variation of my headliner that I can put to convey the message that I'm trying to convey. So I really appreciate that.
Could you explain some of the similarities and differences between paganism and witchcraft?
Absolutely. So paganism, as I alluded to earlier, it's a very large umbrella term, and it covers a number of traditions, ancient and modern, all over the world. So it's basically any religion that was practiced prior to Judaism or Christianity. Actually, Judaism at its core was polytheistic, but that's a topic for another day entirely. We won't get too off into the weeds over there. But it's important to understand also that paganism, was a modernized term. This was not something that the indigenous people had referred to their practice at. Pagan didn't exist. That was more of a Christianized term, which even later led to being synonymous with Satanism, which is entirely not correct at all. In fact, Satan never had or had anything to do with the practices of the indigenous cultures of the land. Paganism is rather characterized by the experience of divine power inherent in the natural world and not separate from it. And witchcraft is a practice of magic. It's specifically the practice of magic. So by definition, every practice of witchcraft is pagan by definition, but not every pagan practitioner is a practitioner of magic, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, I think some people get confused about the two, and I guess dabble in both. I don't call, my practice witchcraft, but others probably would, because I'm, studying the moon cycles and, doing my readings and just writing like what's going on and just documenting my process and making space to like meditate and light a candle. But I mean, I'm sure that some people might call that witchcraft, but
yeah, absolutely.
I think that's the fun thing about paganism though, is like you can make up your own rituals or you can follow, other people's rituals, whatever it is. But
it is so true. In fact, I would say from what I've seen now, it's not uncommon for modern day practitioners of magic to just be exclusive practitioners of magic, and they don't really even affiliate with the term pagan, or they're not even really that devout into the ancient practices.
Right.
They more so blend it into sort of this more modernized Western spiritual practice, which is fine. It totally is fine. It is an aspect of pagan practices, but a lot of people, especially in the West, have taken that and they have just developed sort of their own, what's often referred to as Western spirituality, which is sort of its own genre. And it has aspects of pagan practices to it, but it's not inherently pagan, if that makes sense.
Right. So, could you share a little bit about some of the practices of some of the indigenous cultures and ways we can work with some of this wisdom? Also, how do you think that some of these cultures merged?
Yes, absolutely. This is an amazing question, and this goes back to what we were discussing earlier regarding every culture sharing the same principal roots. If we take away the terms, the cultural terms, the language, and we look at the practices, we take away the physical appearance of all these cultures, we're going to notice some very, very common roots. And some of those roots are acknowledging that there is a divine presence in nature. Nature and life are sacred and worthy of reverence, especially the planet itself is considered a living being that we owe our respect and love. There's animism. So basically what that means is all things in nature are alive and conscious in some important way. And not only humans and other animals, but other inanimate things sometimes are perceived as having their own consciousness. Rocks, water, air, fire, the elements. Everything in the universe is considered sacred, and the force is eminent in all things, and all things are worthy of all of our respect. Another example of this would be that the physical world is simply an illustration of the ultimate reality, and it's good, and it's to be enjoyed by all living things. It's the ultimate reality. There's also the belief that consciousness extends far beyond the restraints of physical forms. Consciousness survives death and exists simultaneously on multiple planes of reality. Ethics and morality are based on avoidance of intentional harm to other beings. Personal responsibility for your actions. What you do shall return to you in time in one way or another. Also, at the core of this, polytheism, the belief that there are many gods and goddesses, and through rituals and other spiritual practices, we can connect with the divine in an experimental way. Reincarnation is also a central tenet in many of these varieties of paganism.
It's been so fun, like going into the records and asking certain questions, and then sort of just discovering that our ancestors were kind of spot on with their observations. And even though they each had their own lens and their own culture that they brought forth, when I'm in the records and I'm asking about like just animism, like there literally is a life force in everything. And
Absolutely everything.
so you're sitting on this bench that's made out of wood, but at some point that was a tree. And if
Yes.
time is irrelevant, then that tree still exists. So that life force that was that tree, even though it's been cut down and reformed into something else, is still in the thing you're sitting on. So it's just been so awesome to have this connection and things that just felt true to me, based on things of just studying these other cultures. When I asked, it's like, yes, yes, they're right in that way. And of course there's so many versions of the truth, right? There's so many things, but I just feel like we can learn so much about ourselves by looking back and trying to understand what these other cultures were conveying, because sometimes there might be like a language barrier, or if you haven't ever like considered some of these concepts, it might be hard for you to wrap your head around it. I feel like if you stick with it and you try to understand, like it makes so much sense, even to like the modern mind. It's just making space to sit with those truths.
Absolutely. And I love the analogy that you used with the bench. I mean, that's perfect right there. That bench at one point was a tree. The tree was a living being, and that energy never dies. It simply transforms. And this is a phenomenal way to look at this, honestly. And yeah, I truly do believe that the ancients did have this right. And as time has gone on, that continuum has extended, and we have limited our minds and our belief systems. And we are, even if we are not of, say, a Christian faith or Islamic faith, we still live in a heavily influenced Christian society. So we look at things through a Christianized lens of black and white. And that really does limit a lot of beliefs in terms of our capabilities. Also, in Vedic scriptures, we are also in the Kali Yuga time period, which is also the age of greatest spiritual disconnect. So it's hardest for us to even comprehend what it means to be in tune with the spiritual nature. I mean, it's almost a foreign concept that eludes us because we are living in that age. And until we really go within and do that deep level of introspection, we have a hard time even grasping what that means.
Right. I do feel as though collectively there are more and more people interested in meditation and having just little experiences here and there. Like I cannot tell you how many people have told me my third eye is not open, I don't see anything, but they're like, but I do see color. And I'm like, well, that's kind of something. So I feel like everyone's like right on the edge of like, they're wanting to know, they're starting to do these practices, they're having some experiences. But yeah, it's not like psychic download. Now they have everything, it's like, it takes like practice and just spending time like in these certain states, before you really can say, okay, when I'm in this state, I'm accessing like the Akashic records, or I'm, able to really channel into my subconscious, or, because it like, you don't really know what you're doing right away. But I do think that like there's more people than ever in my lifetime that are asking questions and doing practices. And it's kind of like they're just following their own intuition on it.
Absolutely. And that's what it comes down to, is following your own intuition. And if we're too heavily guided by either too heavily swayed toward the heart or the mind, then we'll always want to rationalize our experiences or justify why it's not correct. But if we listen to the intuition, which is, in my opinion, separate from the heart and the mind, then we can truly start to really remember who we are. And it's just like I always say, I'm obviously a physical person, and, I can equate this to working out. When you first begin a workout routine or a workout regimen, you are building your muscle, you are engaging in progressive overload, and you don't just start out with becoming a world-class athlete. When you step foot into the training center, you periodize your training just like you would exercise your spiritual muscle. But you have to be able to have that belief that you can take that step. And then from there, you have to be willing to be receptive to opening.
Right. Yeah, when you said belief, I think that's so much is that the beliefs like you were saying, like, because we've sort of been raised in a Christian society, even if we don't identify as that. So for me, I really had to kind of just take everything off the table and then formulate, like, what do I believe? Because I think our fears, or there's limiting beliefs that are actually holding us back from having another experience. So if you're terrified of meditation, or you're scared to like lucid dream, or like people will tell me all the time, like, I was right there, I could feel, myself like merging into the dream, and I got scared and I pulled myself right back out.
Yes.
And so it's like these limiting beliefs and fears are why we're not able to go there, because I feel like our mind is trying to like protect us in that way. So it's working on like asking yourself, well, what do I believe, and is this belief like serving me? Is this belief holding me back from exploring anything new? So I feel like I'm all the time asking myself that. And one of my rituals with the moon is like to clear any limiting belief that's preventing me from making progress.
Which is amazing. Absolutely. Yeah. And it really does. It comes down to fear. Fear is like the number one driving factor that serves as that precursor to prevent us from being that genuine self. And that could be fear of uncertainty. That could be fear of the unknown. That could be fear of, should we say it, going to hell? Because let's be honest, there are people out there who will tell you that meditation is an access way to the devil.
Right.
Yes, they will tell you that. And even if you don't directly believe that, you have that in the back of your mind. Like, if I start meditating and I start getting these thoughts of these, other dimensional realms of existence, it's the devil coming in. And, and that always obviously causes some kind of fear. Who isn't afraid of eternal damnation, right?
Right. For sure. But I feel like if you can work on the fear and get past it, and you're in those states, you realize that it's actually nothing to be afraid of, and that we're like pulling in the experiences that we need. And so I feel like the energy is sort of matching us. So like when we're ready for, a certain, maybe a master, or just even like, sometimes it's like the energy of love, or just like it can be a theme. Like sometimes I'm in the records, and that one day the guide was a chakra, and that was the guide for the day. And I was like, oh, okay, so chakras are kind of alive if you're saying that the chakras are guide. So there's something to that, But at that point I was ready. So I just don't feel like spirit is ever dumping anything on you like that you're not ready to handle. But if you're so terrified that you can't even go to like a sound healing because you're scared, of vibrational medicine, or like, it's wild how it's almost like the system wanted to put that in place so that you never fully accessed your own like divine intelligence, that you were born with.
Yes, I do believe that this was originally the intention when Catholicism spread from Emperor Constantine. And when people of prestigious Christian roles were specifically appointed in roles of power, and this is largely how the initial spread of Christianity began to spread across Europe, and then from there the world, and from there it was this or that. You accept this as fact, or you will forever, eternally be excluded. And that gets passed on from generation after generation after generation. And then all of a sudden, here we are, generations of exposures to this belief systems. Well, now it's like, okay, we got to take a step back. How do we release and transcend above this fear?
Right. For sure. Let's talk a little bit about deities.
Yes.
Do you think that deities live forever?
Oh, this is an amazing question. I'm really glad you asked this. And as much as I would love, I actually don't love the fact that this is not a simple yes or no answer because I'm going into detail. So this largely depends on the culture you ask. Now, when I meet a deity face to face in the flesh, I will have a conclusive answer, perhaps. But what we do have is we have the ancient belief systems of some of the oldest records we have, or in the Vedic teachings, or we can look at the belief systems of the ancient Norse or the ancient Greek, or how the Native Americans perceive their deities. And first, I think it's important to identify what does to die mean, and ask ourselves if death is perceived the same by a god as if it is by humans. So by definition, By Greek definition, I should say, actually, gods do not die. By nature, gods are anti-death. They are without death. The actual Greek word means immortal or without death. And in fact, in English, that's what it translates to, is immortal. But so basically, there's a difference between an immortal creature that lives indefinitely and a god that just simply lacks the capacity to die at all. So it's natural that humans should die. So an immortal human stagnates within one life, but a god doesn't necessarily experience our birth-death cycle. It just is, at least at its core. Now, this is largely stemming from a lot of the Greek beliefs, where the concepts of immortality were highly touched on. Now, there are several sagas within, say, the Norse mythos, where gods regularly die, but their death, quote unquote, doesn't necessarily seem to imply the end of all. So what I mean by that is, give an example, Odin sacrificed himself on the world tree Yggdrasil, where he, quote unquote, died, but he was reborn as a higher conscious being. He was said to attain the runes and to unlock the secrets of the cosmos. It was also foretold in the sagas that the events of Ragnarok would lead to the twilight of the gods, which literally means the death of the gods. There's also the story of Balder, the god who was killed, but he was reborn in Helheim, where he was said to live until the new cycle of life would start, where he would subsequently be reborn into the new world following the events of Ragnarok. So does this imply that these gods die and then they're reincarnated? Or perhaps is this a spontaneous rebirth without the need to even experience the entire cycle of life from quote-unquote god infancy into the right prime god, a forgetting consciousness of their past godly selves? Maybe are their deaths merely metaphorical? Or perhaps a god's true nature is that without death, but if they take the form of a physical vessel, such as a body, then perhaps they're subjecting themselves to the same laws of the cosmos that we humans experience. So there's a lot of different concepts on how this is perceived. Now let's look a little further into this, into the Vedic concept of what's called devas, which loosely translates from gods. So this actually suggests that there are divine beings, that there are celestial beings, but they're simply extremely long-lived, as in millennia. So often, even to the extent that they're unaware of their own mortality due to their astronomical lifespan. So according to Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, these beings have accumulated divine karma. They've been reborn as these godly celestial beings who inhabit what we would call heavenly realms of existence, which we could even include the Christian heaven, Muslim paradise, and even Asgard of the Norse, and so on. And in this cosmology, the devas are highly differentiated from direct manifestations of the divine source. Now, perhaps these gods or devas are more like what we could consider supernatural beings rather than actual gods. But I do believe that these beings are much, much more spiritually developed than humans. So I think when we strip away all these terms, it really comes down to what beings are we talking about? How do we define death? And are they simply much more spiritually in tune with their consciousness than we humans are? So these are just a few different perspectives that a few different cultures have on this question.
Yeah. I was thinking about, like Krishna being an incarnation of Vishnu. And so I've never heard like the story of like Vishnu dying. And I mean, maybe I could try to find it. So I always wonder if Vishnu, which is like the core essence or like the beginning of that energy,
Yes,
is taking different forms, but like Vishnu still exists even though Krishna exists. Like that Vishnu might be kind of like the higher self.
yes, absolutely. So Vishnu is considered a direct manifestation in a sense of the Brahman or the divine source, which would be Lord Vishnu is the preserver. Now, it is said that Lord Vishnu has incarnated multiple times, and Krishna was one of the most prominent incarnations. And in fact, according to the Hindus, Lord Buddha was also an incarnation. There are sects of Buddhism that do disagree, but it is commonly accepted that Buddha is a incarnation of Lord Vishnu. Now, these are what would be considered a god in physical form. Or an avatar, which is actually a Vedic term. And of course, Lord Krishna did die. He was killed. But Vishnu himself is the soul, as you mentioned, the essence of the energy, who is beyond death, beyond the cycle of life and death, if that makes sense.
That makes so much sense, because I've always wondered that, because even though there are people that celebrate Krishna, they still worship Vishnu.
Yes.
So they honor like his other incarnations, but like there's, a whole, I think most of them, most of the Hindus worship, like I think I looked at the percentages one day, and Vishnu was like the main one. So like there was the Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. So Shiva was like the second most popular in like the worship part. So people still worship Vishnu. Like he's huge, more than just Krishna, which is just one of his incarnations.
Exactly. And I believe Krishna was incarnated as Krishna to be able to relate more to humankind in the human flech.
Right.
Which is what, and he provided the teachings, brought the teachings of the Vedic scriptures to us to be able to apply in our life. And then it's even believed that Lord Buddha, who came after Krishna, had come back, thousands of years later to provide his dharma and say, hey, we don't need to do it this way, because the Buddha was born into a time to where there was a wealth of animal sacrifice going on, even human sacrifice. So it's believed that the Buddha came down as an incarnate to say, hey, we don't need to continue to do this. There are other ways to self-liberation. And he provided the Dharma, the Buddha Dharma, to teach people the introspective way to self-liberate.
Yes, I love that. I really love studying all of the different avatars and all of the masters, and it's wild because they're in the records. So today the Buddha was one of my guides. He was just like teaching me to surrender and go with the flow and just sort of trust and not overthink things, and I was like, that's so funny. But like this deity is literally sending me this message in the records, which makes me feel as though it's a lot, like there is life to it. It's not just some archetypal energy.
Right.
It feels very much alive. So I don't know. I feel like it's because if any person has ever existed in time, that you can access them even if they were killed, So Krishna, even though you said Krishna did die, like you might still be able to tap into his essence in the records. So it's so wild to me to discover this. And then it just totally changed the way I viewed like what is alive,
Yes. And just like we were talking about, what does alive and death really mean?
Right.
And can we really look at that through the lens of our human consciousness? And I think there's much deeper layer than this topic, than our very limited scope of the cycle of life and death. The body physically dies, it decays like a pair of old clothes. And that's even in the Vedic teachings. What does it mean to be reborn or to reincarnate? It means we simply let go an old pair of clothes and we step into a new pair of clothes. And perhaps to a godly celestial being, it is as simple as that, as us taking out new clothes. But to us, we have a hard time comprehending life before or after life.
Right. And I feel like the deities, when they're incarnating, even if they are incarnating into a physical vessel, they still have the memory of who they are. So Krishna, as a little child, like had power and knew who he was. There wasn't a point where he was like, I have to discover myself. No,
exactly.
It was like he, from a baby, already knew, and same thing with like Mercury, like or Hermes, like he was already like causing mischief right out the gate. He already had all of his mental capacity, and he was already fully embodied into himself, so he didn't have to wait until after middle school and before he could like read or formulate certain ideas. Like he was already very much in his body.
Absolutely. And I do believe this is amazing, because it brings up another side point too, is human beings. Unless we achieve this specific level of consciousness with meditative practices, we cannot recall fully, at least, past lives until we are at a specific state as described by the Buddhist teachings. But I do believe that if you are of a godly being or a celestial being, that you have that consciousness that sort of transfers from vessel to vessel to vessel. And perhaps they even have the choice to be reborn, from infancy godhood, or are you just simply spontaneously entering into a new realm? I mean, there's all these other possibilities as well. There's a lot of ancient stories of Balder, the god, who when he died, he was just simply in Halim. It didn't say he was reborn as baby Balder. He was just there, as he will be into the new world after the events of Ragnarok. So it's definitely interesting to look at it from that scope.
Right. It's because once they leave the physical vessel or that particular dimension, like they don't necessarily have to come back. They
Exactly, right.
Because there's so many other dimensions. So I think with that instance, maybe he was just comfortable with the dimension he was in, and he's like, this is where I'm going to stay for now.
Right.
Just because we cross over doesn't mean we have to come right back,
Exactly. And in
So.
fact, sometimes it might not happen for thousands, millennia. There's no particular time period that says the soul is in an immediate state of rebirth at all. In fact,
Right.
it could be very, very busy in Bardo, which is a Buddhist term, in its limbo state. There are some ceremonial practices that can be used to sort of expedite the rebirth of the soul. But
Right.
yes, I'll largely believe that is also what a ghost would be,
Right.
which is an in-between state between the next cycle of life.
Right. The in-between world. And I think a lot of the religions have that sort of like the purgatory kind of place, or like the Kamaloka, or
Yes.
and so you cross over, now you're in sort of like the spirit realm, and that also has different realms within it.
Yes,
like
they
so
do.
each dimension has multiple like levels to it.
They really are. The Buddha said that there are immeasurable worlds of existence, immeasurable. And yeah, most of these belief systems have what is referred to as the underworld, which is not a hell,
Right.
As a lot of mistaken beliefs are. It's not a hell, but I look at the underworld as being sort of an in-between state. The underworld, the initial period where you would you transition to after death. Hades would be an example in the Greek mythos, or Halim in the Norse, and the Mayans have their own. There's a number of various underworlds where it's said to the soul would go to inhabit for a given period of time. There's really no specific time periods, but if we do look at the Vedic teachings, it does say that is typically either a period of time to where we are reborn again, or until our karmic effects warrant a rebirth.
Right. I was just reading this book. It was William Walker Atkinson. He also wrote the Kabbalion. But in this book, he was talking about the levels of the astral plane. And he was talking about how, like, when we die, like there's our astral body is like a shell, but our soul goes on, but the astral body kind of stays, just like our physical body doesn't just disappear.
Right.
So then our astral body is kind of lingering in the in between, and that made me think of like the underworld, because they're just sort of like floating through. They're not like, they don't have desires or anything. They're just sort of like there. But he said that like when people are doing like seances and they're like, tapping into these ghosts, that it's not even the soul, sometimes you might be able to do that through different methods, but a lot of times that they're actually like tuning into that in-between realm that the astral shell is in. It still has some of the data and the life experiences and the stories within it.
Absolutely. It's imprinted in it. Yeah, that's fascinating you say that too, because I believe the soul is actually different than the spirit. I believe the soul is the broadcast. Like watching a TV. Say you turn on the TV and you have a specific channel on there, and say you're foreign to the concept of what a TV even is. So you turn it on and you see the display, the picture, the video, the audio on there. And now say your TV breaks, a person not familiar with the concept of how broadcasting work would be like, oh, there it goes. It's broken.
Right.
But if you put up another TV and you connect to the same network, like, oh, it's back. So that's the soul. That's the soul broadcasting life into the body. And I believe that the spirit is sort of the life force that permeates through each physical vessel, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that description of it for sure. Could you talk a little bit about the principle of cause and effect and how it relates to karma?
Absolutely. Cause and effect really is how our actions will come back around to us for the good or the better. And the Buddha did speak about this too in his teachings. We have the Noble Eightfold Path, which speaks on right action, right intention, so on and so forth, right thought. And we need to ensure that our behavior is in alignment with all of these paths, these 8 paths, with pure intent, pure actions, and as close as we can get to that, the more we stray away from our inner goodness. So morality is not legislated by your belief in a deity or your devotion to a deity. It's based upon doing no intentional harm to other beings. So we accumulate so much impression throughout our life, from our childhood, our exposures to our family, to, I mean, you can take any child who has gone through a traumatic experience and now that has shaped them into them feeling like they're insecure. So now they feel they need to treat others badly because it makes them feel empowered. So now they were acting out of malice, right? And now that malice is carried over inside them. Now they're doing harm to others, and now those others are doing harm to other people, and that's creating a ripple effect. So this is cause and effect. So this is why it's so important to be mindful of our actions to ensure that we accumulate good karma, or even better, transcend all karma. And this is a question that has come up before is there a way to really, I guess, this is a Christian term, but atone or repent. So there is no deity that can really forgive us for wrongdoings, but that's up to us to become self-realized. And there is actually a specific case in the Pali Canon of the Buddhist teachings. And there's a story. Angulimala was a serial killer during Buddha's time, and he killed hundreds of people, and he created a necklace out of his victims' fingers. Sounds pretty savage, doesn't it? You didn't get much more bad than that guy. But he became an arahant before the karmic effects of those killings came to be in full force. Had he not have followed the Buddhist teachings, he would have remained in these low forms of realms for millions of years to come to pay his karmic debts. Perhaps even worse off as a human being, or even in a hell realm. And this could have set him up for eons of suffering because he was not able to transcend that terrible karma of what he did. And that goes to the question about, well, it's not always black and white. What about if I have to do harm to somebody else? And what if I have to defend myself? And then people get caught up in, all the intricate details about this. And there was actually a general of an army who asked the Buddha a similar question. His question was, when I kill an enemy in battles, is that not a violation of the first precept of do no harm to living beings? Now, the Buddha said that a battle is fought often to protect a country, or protect countless lives, or protecting the Dharma. And that is not a violation of the first precept. And it shows what the underlying intention of your actions are. For example, what are the underlying intentions involved in being a Shaolin warrior? Is it health? Then that's not a violation of the first precept. Is it for protection against somebody? Then that's not a violation. Is it to use to remove laziness from the body and the mind? That's also not a violation. Is it used to protect yourself or somebody else other than yourself? That's also not a violation. So you can see there's certain cases in which there are no contradictions. So this is an example of being able to be mindful of our actions and understanding the actual intent of why we do what we do in combination with the effect of why we do what we do.
Right. And really stepping into more of the Dharma and trying to consciously not accumulate more karma, because we're really on our path.
Yes.
And where we are being mindful and practicing compassion when we need to. And I feel like that's what all these avatars are kind of trying to teach. This is how you neutralize it, right? This is how you stop, accumulating the karma, but karma's going to get you, so Saturn's, associated with karma in astrology. And I was reading this Vedic myth, and it was talking about Saturn, and even Saturn's guru, he still has those harsh transits. And if he has accumulated any karma, he has to do. And it was like, it said at one point, even Krishna himself, doesn't get past the law of karma. So it's not just humans that have to deal with that. Even on these other planes, it's that's the law of cause and effect. It has to be brought into balance, and the dues have to be paid. If you've done something, you have to, you're going to have to work on balancing that energy back out now. So.
Absolutely. And if you don't pay for it in this lifetime, you will in the next and the next. And there are no limitations into how many incarnations you can have. And that could be a really long time. And if you continue down the path of a downward spiral, you might not get that opportunity to be reborn as a human. And, the Buddha said something along the lines of the chances of being reborn as a human are as rare as a turtle surfacing, I believe, was once every 1,000 years of the ocean and happened to stick his neck through a hoop of the ocean. And that's how rare it would be. So, that goes to show you that it's important to pay attention to every single moment.
Right. So it's not like hell, but it's like which is different. I feel like it's different. But if you've accumulated a lot of karma, it might feel like hell.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
it's like you're doing it to yourself.
Right. And he even said that there are hell realms. And this is a loose translation, not like the Christian hell, which is eternal damnation. He did say that none of them are eternal. They could be a
Right.
very long time,
Right.
but none of them are eternal, like how we would look at like the Christian or Islamic hell.
I totally agree with that. I really feel like it matches our vibration. So if, we've lived our life in this hostile way and we've just filled our mind with these like dark images of, terrifying things, and if we've acted in that negative way, that when we cross over, like we see all of that and we experience it. But it's literally what you're seeing like is a reflection of like what you are. So like, and I think it's important to see it so you realize, wow, I was really hostile in that life. Like that's kind of scary. Like I need to work on this energy. Like if I reincarnate, this is one of the things I need to work on. So
Absolutely right.
I feel like just knowing that karma's there, like it helps bring me peace, that if someone does anything, like I don't have to like fight them. I'm like, well, that's on you,
Yes.
And I just sort of practice like constant forgiveness on my end. And I'm like, they're going to have to, go through their own thing, whether it's a result of this or something else. Cause I feel like the people that are harming someone, like they end up continually kind of doing that until they address that energy, So I'm like, I forgive you, but so that might like disconnect me from having to work through that karmic bond with them. But they still have to do the work, on their own end.
They do. They absolutely do. And that's the thing. We cannot take anything personal. In fact, one inspiration that I have is Marcus Aurelius, a former Roman emperor, and he was also one of the pioneers who brought Stoicism to modern practice. And he said, he has a book called Meditations, to where he wrote down journals to himself. And now I'm paraphrasing this very roughly here, but he spoke along the lines of, every day in the morning when you wake up, you will say, today I will meet ungrateful, unpleasant, wretched, horrid souls who will unleash their anger, unleash their fury on me through no personal reasons other than their own ignorance of the world. I need to accept that there are people outside of this, and as soon as I accept that I have no power outside of my control, but I am in control of my internal thoughts, then I'm then able to develop the level of understanding to be able to move forward with my day.
Right.
And it's a matter of acknowledging that there are people out there who, through a result of their own ignorance and their own suffering, they will in turn lash out to others. But we need to pump the brakes right there and say, hey, this stops right here at me, and then distance ourselves from that situation. Right.
The other night, I was literally thinking about this exact thing, and the Bible verse of Jesus saying, forgive them for they know not what they do. I'm like, I think this is what he's talking about. It's like, if you just forgive them right off the bat, then you don't go out and hurt somebody else. And so you're kind of in your own way, like you're stepping into your power and you're saying, well, this person might be this way, but I'm not going to feed this.
Exactly. And a lot of people hear the word forgive and they think it means that you're pardoning their behavior. It does not mean pardoning their behavior. It means that you are not allowing their behavior to become a personal insult to you, to where that holds weight over you. So you can let go of that. And now you can move on with your life, and you can guide them to water. But, until then, they need to be able to, like you said, take those steps to ensure that their actions are in alignment with the greater good.
Right. Could you give some background on Viking shamanism? Are there people still practicing this today?
Yeah, so there's not a lot of surviving information on whether the ancient Norse practiced actual shamanism, but there is a book that I have read called The Viking Way, and that's written by Neil Price, who does interpret a lot of these teachings as relating to shamanism. So they actually had a class of women, specifically women, called vulva. And they practice what would be considered like a form of shamanism, or like adjacent to it, sort of like a religious role, where they would enter into a trance-like state, and they would perform seances, and they would have prophetic visions, as well as work with magic with the help of the spirits for their community. This practice was actually called Seidr. It's spelled Seidr. And this was specifically for women. And in fact, when any man would practice this role, they would be ridiculed, all these things. It was very, very shunned for men to practice this art. They did have seers, people who would be able to prophesize the future. Also, according to the sagas, though, they had runic inscriptions, and those had magical powers. And with the aid of these runes, you could predict the future, you could protect a person, you could heal diseases, you could write down conjuring spells, curses. Now, most of these runes are essentially like learning the language of the universe, which is probably, one of the, who could even pick up a second language with ease as it is, yet learning and mastering something like this. So this is an example of some of the more magical sides of the ancient Norse. And yes, they are still practiced today by some groups of practicing pagans, and whether they are, I guess you can say, true to the roots is uncertain, simply because we just don't have sufficient records to determine that, but they have definitely been reconstructed.
Yeah. I love that there's space for women within like the Viking spirituality, where, within the Catholic Church and things like that, it's sort of like the women are just like pious and like they're just doing like they're not able to like teach or definitely not channel information in or anything like that. So I really love that in the older beliefs that women were like equals, or they had their own important role and men had their own important, and then they come together, because maybe the women are channeling the message and then the men are whatever practice they're doing,
Exactly. And it's actually the women were commonly in roles of medicine in healthcare as well as that. In fact, a goddess Air was often attributed to being the goddess of healing and health, and in the Norse belief systems as well. So yes, it's absolutely a very prominent aspect of that culture.
Yeah. Something, I haven't told you this, but something I picked up on when I was in the records is I've been asking about people's ancient names, like their first name, like the first name of their first incarnation. And I've been writing them down, and the way that so far the ones I've gotten have been received are in a weird language. So then I ask the records to interpret it, and then they'll give me a English word that's the closest vibration to those symbols. And what I noticed is that like a third of the letters look like the runes. And I'm like, whoa, what is going on here? And, I think there is something to the vibration of these shapes. Like, I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm like, I've seen this symbol before.
Yes.
But some of it looks like a totally different language. And then some of it will look like runes. And I'm like, what is going on? Some of it looks like the Phoenician alphabet.
Yeah.
So I feel like our ancestors were tapping into that, something that's way beyond even this dimension.
Absolutely. And this is something that Odin claimed to have attained the knowledge of, the incomplete knowledge of these runes, and then passed it on to us to be able to apply to our lives as well. But yes, he didn't create the runes. He learned the runes, and he mastered the runes. So it just goes to show you that the vastness of this cosmos is almost beyond our comprehension.
Right. Do you believe that we choose this life, and can certain vows or commitments carry over from other lifetimes?
It's a great question. So I have been asked this question before, and it inspired me to research some of the oldest historical findings that I have found on the concepts of karma and reincarnation, which dates back to the Vedas, the Pali Canon of India. And these all suggest that our rebirth is largely designed on the accumulative karma that we've acquired, whether good or bad. So the outright belief that people choose how to reincarnate doesn't necessarily come from the Dharmic teachings. These, those origins are more of, talking about the entire concept of reincarnation. But if you read the scriptures, they actually state that your karma alone does not determine how you reincarnate. Two factors determine that. That's karma and vasana. And vasanas means your tendencies within your consciousness. So this is where we might have some sway, but there are some people who think that we pick out our lives like picking out a book off the shelf. And I don't think it's quite like that. So say, for example, that let's say in your life that you are deeply attached to, well, say, the ocean. You love the ocean. You think about it all the time. You always long to be at the ocean. You have a beach house. So you die. Then when you reincarnate, it's quite likely that you will take birth in or near the ocean. Your karma will also be a major factor, of course, though. Say you have terrible karma. So now you might be reborn as a very low ocean creature, a bottom feeder, or disease due to ocean pollution, or will soon fall prey to predation or commercial fishing, or die an unpleasant death in the water. Something terrible. That doesn't sound good. With good karma, and so you're born with a great human family who lives by the ocean side or some other pleasant option. So this can be where we can choose, but it's not necessarily choosing like selecting a book. So according to the Dharmic teachings, it's kind of a misunderstanding how you choose to reincarnate into a conscious and specific way, like picking parents off a menu or choosing your birth date, etc. But if you have deep attachment to your family line or a specific different family line throughout your life, then it may be very likely that you will be born into that family or at least adjacent to it. So kind of look at it this way. See it as like a giant machine. You pour in the ingredients, and these are all karmic seeds, your previous actions, speeches, thoughts that have generated reactions in others and in the world. All these will eventually come to you after being fermented and processed in the system, which is also participated by others in nature. And then so the concept of reincarnation begins.
I've been really evaluating like my natal chart as far as my karmas and things with my parents and things like that. And I was asking the records, I'm like, why did I choose, what have I done? And they actually said that it's not so much a karmic thing, but that my soul desired to expand in this lifetime. And so I actually chose a family that would do all of the wrong things so that I would, like, at a young age, go ahead and start pursuing this path, because I would feel so alone and I would just seek. And even some of the harsh disciplines like taught me certain mental tricks, from other lifetimes where I had like basically mastered like meditation and like astral projection. So that even the harshest things that I went through were basically to help activate things I learned from past lives, so that by the time I got to where I'm at now, like 30, I'd already had a really good foundation and I could actually do more work in this lifetime. So they were like, it's not even so much like, oh, you deserve this. They were like, but this was like in alignment to what you needed to expand spiritually in this lifetime, which is something I actually had like the desire
Yes.
to do.
That's funny. That goes right along with the vasanas, the preference, having such a strong preference.
Right.
And if your karma is conducive to supporting that, then you created that perfect chemical soup to create that life for you next time. And it's also a belief too that where your devotion lies in your life is also dependent a lot on where you go. If you have sufficient karma and say you are highly devoted to a deity, you might go to that deity's abode.
Right.
You might be reborn in Asgard, or you might be, if you are of the Christian faith, even a lot of pagans would not dismiss the concept of Christ's heaven or the Father's heaven. If you are devoted to him, you may go there with strong enough devotion. So they don't even dismiss that that's a possibility.
Right. Yeah, the same book I was reading about the astral planes, he was talking about, it really is like what we wish to see, what we've kind of put in our minds throughout our lives, like what we want to see. So that's kind of where we go. So he's like saying every religion that's created their own world, like all of those worlds actually exist. And
yes,
it's,
yes, they do.
What do you desire? And but it was also saying like atheists who imagine that nothing, like there actually is a nothing realm. Eventually those souls do get cycled back in and they get a new experience.
Yes.
But there's actually a point where they are seeing nothing.
Totally.
So it's like, okay, you might want to be a little
exactly
mindful about what you believe and what you're desiring to see when you cross over.
It really is. And it just goes to show you that we live in a world that's beyond black and white. It's like people think, well, there's even a heaven or a hell, or there's nothing. No, it's so much more. There are immeasurable worlds and infinite possibilities of rebirths and realms. And it's these teachings demonstrate that. They really do.
Right. And I even have heard some people, they're actually living out multiple incarnations at the same time.
Absolutely. The multiverse, in fact, is a very, very strong proponent in the Hindu cosmology. We live in universes side by side. In fact, multiple overlapping dimensions, realms of existence are happening simultaneously. Yes.
Yeah, I totally believe it. And I think that sometimes when we're accessing like past lives, that because time isn't what we think it is,
Right.
it's actually, we're actually still there.
Yes.
So we're able to tap into our minds in these other places once we realize that that is even a possibility, because if you don't have the belief or the understanding, then you're not even going to be able to do any of that.
Absolutely.
But once you open yourself up to that possibility, you realize that like each incarnation that you've ever had is actually accessible to you. It's not like the way the gods just know everything. You have to actually seek it, I think.
Yes.
When you're in the third dimension.
I believe you do.
So you have to have the intention, you have to have a question or a reason why you would want to connect to that aspect of yourself. But once you make that connection, it's absolutely amazing, like what this other aspect of you can share with you.
It really is. It really is. You always have to have both the discipline and the character to be able to access this. Some people have one and not the other. Some people are very disciplined in life, but they're just not spiritually in tune.
Right.
Some people are very spiritually in tune, but they're so scatterbrained where they don't have the discipline to apply these practices. But when you have the discipline and the character to do this is the perfect formulation to be able to access this greater aspects of yourself.
Yes, I think it's sort of like earth and air. So having your head in the clouds, but your feet on the ground.
Yeah.
And if you have too much air, you can't ground any of the information you receive.
I love that
analogy.
And
if you're too rooted in the earth, then you're not going to be able to expand your mind in the way that's needed. So it's actually like that balance of like the higher and the lower, and not saying, oh, I'm a high frequency. No, like being of the earth is important too.
Yep.
How are you going to bring anything back?
We are in a physical vessel right now. We are in this physical vessel. Right. And as long as we're in a physical vessel, we are bound by the laws of this physical material world. We are. Now, it doesn't mean we cannot transcend that, but we are as long as we're in this body.
Right. And I've been trying to just really honor my physical vessel more, and like being present here and not thinking, oh, this is a matrix, everything sucks here, earth is terrible. I've been trying to think, thank you, Mother Earth. Like,
sure.
I really am enjoying my stay here and just trying to practice more gratitude. And as much as I'm able to access these other realms and places like that, and it's amazing, but I make that a special devotion practice. I'm still very much physically here the rest of the time. Like, I want to be here on the earth, and I don't think Gaia is just something that's been taken over. I think if you're seeing that, then that's the vibration that you're on. But I think that she's a wonderful goddess, and I think the third dimension is just as important as all the other ones.
They absolutely are. We have to be able to understand it first, at least to a degree, before we can begin to transcend into higher realms.
Right, and then just honor where we're at in our journey.
Very well said.
Yeah. So, do you see any kind of connection between Yggdrasil and the chakra system?
I do. In fact, this is not something that's canon. This is mere theory, and that's even a stretch to say. But this is just based off of what I would call headcanon, which is a comic term to basically put different pieces of the puzzle together. So I'll get to this here. So basically, as we talked about, all early cultures were so related, and there's such a strong root between the Indo-European cultures. And the chakras in Yggdrasil are no exception to that. So there's actually a book which opened my eyes to this called The Seed of Yggdrasil, which relates the tree to both the universe and the human body. And there are beliefs that suggest that Yggdrasil represents both the cosmos in its entirety as well as the human body. Oh, and this is all speculation, like I said. But if we put this together and we start looking at the creatures on Yggdrasil, the tree, we can start to see how they can represent the chakras. For example, at the top of Yggdrasil, there's an eagle. Now, this is a nameless eagle. It doesn't have a name, but there's an eagle. And this is in the attestations of the Poetic Edda. He sits at the top of Yggdrasil. And it's also believed to stand for the third eye, because the eagle also has a small hawk sitting in between his eyes. And it's often alluded to that this eagle has knowledge of all things. Now we go back to the root of Yggdrasil. We have Nidog the dragon. Well, what does Nidog the dragon do? Nidog the dragon is said to be gnawing relentless at this tree. He's eating away at the tree. There are also 4 red deer on Yggdrasil that are said to chew on the leaves of the tree. And there's also a squirrel that runs up and down to deliver messages between the eagle and the dragon. So the number of creatures on Yggdrasil is in alignment with the number of chakras. Mm-hmm. So let's look at the dragon now. The dragon gnawing on the root indicates the root chakra, aka sexual energy. So according to Norse, now this is theory, it could be perceived that perhaps this is a distraction in life, and if we allow this energy to run rampantly and aimlessly, then it will gnaw on the very fabric of our existence if we're only guided by instinctual response. Mm-hmm. It's gnawing at who we are if we're always distracted. This is why monks practice celibacy, and it's why they're so disciplined in life. Also, the squirrel that runs down seems to be parallel with the chakra responsible for controlling the energy that flows through the body. So interestingly enough, though, in the Chinese culture, including many sects of Taoism, we would refer to that as qi or qi. And qigong is said to be able to harness that particular flow of energy, but they don't necessarily use the word chakras in Chinese culture. So there's a lot of parallels that we're seeing here from a lot of different cultures that are basically saying the same thing.
Right.
So in short, I think there's enough parallels to say there's a connection for sure.
Right. When you were talking about the dragon being at the bottom, I just saw this image of, it's from like the Hermet. It's actually from a Manly P. Hall book, and it's Thoth putting his foot on this. It's like a dragon, and he's literally like got his foot on it, and that's like Typhon, who's like this.
Yes. Yep.
And I was like, that's what I'm seeing when you said that. Which like his foot, if you think about the root chakra, is like extending down to the feet. That might be too also a reference to the chakra system, which I never thought about. Of like having your foot like rooted, but then that's where that dragon is.
Yes, and that dragon, if we correspond it with the root chakra, it doesn't mean that the root chakra is a bad chakra by any means, but it's saying if it's imbalanced. I mean, look what happens if we live a life of hedonism where we just pursue pleasures, which is interesting why it said that dragon is at odds with the eagle. Mm-hmm. The eagle, it stands for all-knowing and self-discipline, and then we have a squirrel that runs back and forth between the two of them.
Right.
At that, talking about the fight, the struggle with the fight between discipline and the hedonistic side of humankind. It's just fascinating to look at it in that sense.
Right. And when you were talking about the squirrel, this also ties in because Thoth and Hermes are, synonymous in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And in esoteric astrology, Mercury, which is associated with Hermes, rules the Anakarana, which is like the heart chakra, because that's the bridge between the higher and lower. So the squirrel going back and forth made me think of Mercury, who's able to bridge this gap and like send messages back and forth. So like this painting was like, when you were talking, I was like, I feel like this is saying the same thing, but I'd never tried to associate the two, but I feel like there's something going on there.
Absolutely. It's so true. And then when we look at the chakra that delivers the energy, and then the Chinese practice the energy of qi.
Right.
I mean, I think I would be the same thing. I mean, we can't come out and say this is this, but hey, this sounds like you guys are kind of saying the same thing.
Right. I definitely think that there's overlaps and similarities, and a lot of these stories are in the art. Like if you just look at that image of Yggdrasil and just evaluate it, then it sort of starts coming alive, and you're like, okay, well, I could see how the squirrel might be relevant,
Right.
It's just so cool. I think it's just a matter of just spending time like pondering it.
So true. It really does. And looking in that book is an amazing book that really helps shine that light onto the parallels of all these teachings. And I mean, really, these teachings are separated by culture. And other than that, that's really it.
Right. I love that. So we're getting close to wrapping up. Could you tell us the best way for our listeners to follow you, and also how to access your Patreon and some of that? I'll add links at the end too. But
absolutely. So I currently run 3 different Instagram pages here. So I have my personal page, which I share everything on there. It's brainsandbrawn.86. I also have, if you're interested in strictly the spiritual components of what I do, that's simply the Syncretic Pagan. And my more recent page is Drengr Discipline. That's DRENGR space discipline. And that is also linked to my Patreon account under Drengr Discipline. And we'll put the links up there. It's a direct link that will click directly on the Patreon. And I have several different tiers that you can subscribe to, as low as $5 a month. And then, of course, as we go up in tiers, this is where we start doing more one-on-one work, more exclusive content, but it's as low as $5 a month, and this is just for basic support. So yeah, if anybody's interested in more of the material I design, feel free to check out any of my Instagram pages. I'm also working on getting my new YouTube account up and launched, as well as my website.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing this wisdom with us.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here as always. I love the opportunity, and I can't thank you enough.
Yes. So anytime you want to come back on, you're always welcome on the show. So.
I appreciate that. Thank you all, and I hope everybody had a great time listening.
Yes, thank you. And thank you all for tuning in. Check us out next time on the Astral Hour.